Thank you both, Stan and Susan. This was a great opening to this discussion. I'd like to throw questions to both of you and then turn it over to the rest of the audience. First, Stan, since you rather definitively said that the Jewish vote is the Jewish vote is the Jewish vote is the Jewish vote. Is there any major constituency in America for whom foreign policy does matter, and for whom there is, the events or decisions by this leader or policies by this opponent could have an impact, especially in this narrow 50-50 election that you've described for us? And Susan, I wanted to pick up on your final comment, which was how foreign leaders are. You referred to Angela Merkel, but more generally, how do you think foreign leaders are viewing our election dynamic? And among the major foreign leaders, can you discern any predilections, preferences, and what might be in what? How would we know it if one of them wanted to try to impact our election campaign? Why don't we start with that? Stan? Please.
Okay. I'm really going to use I apologize. I'm going to really use your question to go to leap beyond it, which is probably what you wanted me to do in any case. And the starting point is: are there any groups for which foreign policy is a central issue and will be impactful, in the election? And also on the question of it not being an issue against Obama. It is partially not an issue against Obama because of his success in dealing with Al-Qaeda and I think perceived success in dealing with Libya across to Pakistan and disengagement from Iraq. If he were not succeeding, it would be an issue. Even in my view, even in an election in which the economy is the dominant piece. I think what you're watching on the Republican side is some, I think, discomfort in finding a way to attack, given George Bush made the war on terrorism as the central measure of metric on whether you're a successful and strong president. His highest marks by far are on the war on terrorism. And therefore, I think you're seeing a bit of scrambling on, what's the angle. But if he did not have this backdrop, I think for sure it would be a factor in the election. People do want a president who can keep the country safe. It's a factor even when maybe it's a 20% factor, but it's a factor in the election. So it's a factor, and it's been somewhat neutralized by, what he's done as president. The issue that we haven't spoken sufficiently about, I believe, is China. The American people are consumed with China and the impact and the failure of elites, failure of Democratic and Republican leaders, failures of companies to address that relationship in a way that was advantageous to the United States and advantageous to American workers, advantageous to American companies. You're watching, in fact, the issue on which Romney has moved, I think, the strongest on foreign policy. It's an economic policy. Is China. If you look at his, the policies advocating, he's competing to be on the right side of the Republican primary field. That is in part related to trying to find some issue to drive through the primary, but I think it's a general election issue in which the president has vulnerability, in which he's gravitating to. But don't miss. Let me talk about the big event that we haven't gotten to. Not a bombing of Iran, is the entry of the third-party candidates into the presidential election. There will be serious third-party candidates in this election. You cannot have this level of discontent in the country, contempt for the parties, contempt for the process, contempt for institutions, without there being leaders who view the opportunity to run and advance their issues. If Ross Perot were running, and we put him in a poll, he'd poll over 30%. And you should remember with Ross Perot, he ran on the deficit, but he also ran against trade and against NAFTA, and he had a strong nationalist position that would have fit the kind of climate we're in now. running against spending and parties and America's entanglement abroad and our interests being sold out by saps, in Washington. The poll that we just did, national poll last week, we tested Ron Paul as an independent. Ron Paul got 18% as an independent in this poll. We tested three candidates, which I also think is possible. We tested Trump, Paul, and Bloomberg. Together, they got 25% of the vote. Okay, you can't have that kind of discontent and opportunity without leaders moving. You should remember, we would not have thought about Ross Perot as a candidate for president in January and I was doing Clinton's campaign. It would not have entered your mind as somebody who was going to run for president and at some point poll in the 30s and end up with almost about 20% of the vote in the election. Okay. China will be the central issue of third-party candidates. Ron Paul uses it. China will drive it and may also lead Romney to also advance the issue in order to try to minimize third-party defections, away from them. If that happens, just like the balanced budget and the budget and the deficit is the main problem in 1992-93 was driven by third-party candidacies with both major parties competing for credibility and those voters. The same can happen here. This could have, I think, a major impact on China foreign policy, since it's not Middle East. But I do think it can play out through this election.
Just before you leave, could you just explain from whom do the 20-25% come?
Heavily from the Republicans. Yeah, I mean, we have in our polls we have the race essentially tied, but I think Obama ends up with a 10-point lead once you bring third-party candidates in, which is one of the. When I go to the plus, it's one of the factors that leads me to think that that eventuality can also is a risk factor for Romney and an opportunity for Obama.
Thank you.
But the China point, I think, is the perfect sort of pivot point between these two questions. I'm so glad you brought it up. I'm going to try to persuade you to write that piece for foreign policy, because I think it's really interesting, and I think it has been underappreciated as a potential sort of shaper of the election conversation later this year. And look at the calendar again, and you think, wow, this is really going to rear right up. It's in October that China is slated to have its major leadership transition, and already many sort of astute China watchers are looking ahead to that transition as an explanation for some of the continuing crackdowns that we're seeing in China against the sort of activist types. Even more efforts to sort of censor things and to build up that internet firewall, in addition to a wave of arrests and sort of disappearances and things that haven't really probably gotten the attention that they're due. And if you attribute at least some significant portion of that not only to nervousness about any spillover effects from the Arab Spring and political turmoil elsewhere in the world, but also to their own nervousness about a next generation of political leadership coming into power at a time when China clearly is going to need to sort of look in the mirror and figure out, some significant as opposed to incremental structural reforms that are necessary to keep going their economic growth, to power their internal needs. It's an inward-looking anxiety at the moment. I still think that. I mean, there is definitely heightened concern about perhaps the policy that the U.S. has had towards China. There's a view in Beijing these days that the U.S. has made efforts to contain China, which is a very loaded word in that conversation. So, already the level of tensions between the two are heightened. The sort of explosion of China into a campaign issue later this year at exactly the time that there will be this leadership transition occurring. I believe it's in early October is when the party congress is slated to make Xi Jinping the new leader of China. Is something that we shouldn't forget about, because it's just too much of a timing coincidence for it not to become an inevitable part of our general election conversation. And that goes to Rob's question. So I would definitely say China's leadership, both old and new, has the ability to shape the conversation in the U.S. election one way or the other. And let's just look at some of the other countries that have elections or transitions set for this year. Israel, we were talking about the possibility of early elections. Russia, obviously, we have the potential Putin coronation / street protests coming up on March 4th. We have France and the re-election bid of Sarkozy, in which his connections to the United States and the leadership role that he's tried to play in this Western coalition are clearly going to be front and center of their internal French debate. Egypt, obviously we have continuing both elections and political turmoil there, big question marks as we come up to the 1-year anniversary of the January 25th movement. Mexico, I think is a sleeper issue in the U.S. campaign. If you look at the campaign that's going to take place, not only in the context of the escalating drug war, but also in the context of the potential at this moment, quite likely return to power of the PRI, which, ruled Mexico as a one-party state for more than 7 decades. And yet this question of the conduct of the drug war in Mexico with the support of the United States, and so the U.S. is going to play a role in that campaign, to the extent to which we are somehow held responsible for the failed policies of the Calderon administration. I think that's a sleeper issue to come back and play a factor in the U.S. campaign later this year.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you. Let's turn the floor over to your questions. Start with Mike, and then Maury, and then we'll move around. Please use the mic, press it on, identify yourself.
Thank you very much. Mike Kraft, former State Department counterterrorism expert. It struck me that nobody's mentioned Afghanistan. To what extent that may play in. I mean, there's already complaints that the administration is orchestrating some backroom talks with the Taliban. Do you expect any element of who lost Afghanistan? Or are people just so fed up with the chances of doing anything there? And the other thing on China, it strikes me, isn't this potentially a two-edged sword? One of the reasons we have difficulty with China is I could see the Democrats portraying this as the greed of capitalism. I mean, it's the Walmarts and others are trying to make big profits, resulting in a lot of American jobs being lost to China. And in view of the attacks on Romney for his business activities from the Republicans, might this kind of backfire too much on Romney if he presses the China card, because some of his cohorts may be seen as responsible or painted as responsible for our huge debt and problems with China?
Those are great questions, and it is striking, isn't it, that Afghanistan even now remains the war that we don't talk about, right? I think in part that reflects a sort of political consensus across the political spectrum when it comes to the electorate. This is just not a time when even hardline Republicans are all that eager to talk about sort of the muscular imposition of American will. And, 10 years into the war in Afghanistan, a war that it would have been anathema really to anyone in either party to say that we're going to wage a decade-long commitment there for an uncertain sort of result and to sort of slink out. So I think partially the absence of conversation about Afghanistan reflects the fact that there's just no percentage in it, when it comes to the electorate to talk about it, because the electorate is not in the mood to even be as engaged in Afghanistan as we are, number one. Number two, I do think you've seen in some of the post-withdrawal from Iraq commentary over the last few weeks, you've seen a hint and a suggestion of what the Republican candidates would do if given an opportunity when it comes to Afghanistan. Because, there have been efforts, there have been pieces, we've run them on our site, there's been, it's been a part of the conversation among Republicans to say, well, did, Obama lose Iraq by the way in which we sort of pulled out, and shouldn't we have negotiated a more robust ongoing presence there? Again, I don't see that resonating very strongly with an American electorate, both Republican and Democrat, that just isn't in the mood for overseas commitments of this sort. And so
I think that's what's driving that. And then just finally on your China point, I think it's well taken, and it's not clear to me that China, for that reason, is a slam dunk issue for Romney.
Just on Iraq for a second, if I could ask both of you, is there any point at which chaos in Iraq, collapse of this Iraqi government, violence, you name it, mayhem, does that at some point reverberate back against the president, or have people just had enough of Iraq?
They've had enough. It won't reverberate back. Let me respond to the question and then go to that question. The country is not for withdrawing from, abruptly from Afghanistan. It's not in a Ron Paul position on Afghanistan. They like the idea that we are dealing with it slowly on a timetable. The same thing was true on Iraq, that they liked a timetable. But they want to see it going down. And as we watched what happened on Iraq, and we watched in the Republican primary debate itself, when Rick Perry talked about potentially sending troops back in. I don't think there was a rush of other Republicans to say, I'm with you. The public is not there. I think they will filter it out. They are done with Iraq. And I think they'll be in the same mode on Afghanistan. So I don't think it'll become an issue depending on how the process is playing out. I think they trust the president to play it out, along with his military, but on the assumption that it's, on a timetable toward us departing. Not abrupt, don't want to change it, but they certainly don't want to revisit re-engaging. If Republicans go there, I think it hurts them. On the China question, I actually think this is a close election. I think Romney has actually embedded himself in this position. This is not the advantage of being in the opposition is that you can advance these positions without, I don't think, owning the consequences of the policies you advance. And I think it's all win for him in terms of looking like he's standing up for a declining, because China is a central part of the narrative on a declining America. If you're not willing to stand up to China, you're not going to be able to reverse it. It's a serious point of advantage. And he's surrounded himself with a team. I think he's announced at day one, part of his, that he'll, declare them to be manipulating currency. I think this is all popular stuff. I have trouble seeing the downside politically.
Maury?
Right here, yeah.
Make sure you press the button.
It's pressed.
Okay, thank you.
My question is really to Stan Greenberg. Do you see any parallels at all to the 1980 election when Carter was being, after some successes, was had quite a bit of disapproval in the Jewish community and roughly got about 53% of the vote, Reagan 37%, and Anderson, a third party, 10%. I see myself a lot of dissatisfaction with Obama policies in the Middle East, and I think it will show up in the election, even though I must admit there isn't a communicator like Reagan running on the Republican side. So I would tend to say that, and I'd be willing to bet, that American Jews will vote anywhere from 30 to 35% for the Republican candidate in November.
You're going to put is that a $10,000 bet?
It's a 10 shekel bet.
Look, it's a fair question. There are three decades. The Reagan election is kind of the beginning of a process of the polarization, of our, electorate with increasingly, ideologically homogeneous, blocks. And remember, Jews are on the liberal side of that, of that equation. They're not, they are leading, this cultural process and react. It is much more important what you're watching, the reaction against what the Republican presidential candidates are saying on a whole range of issues, from gay marriage to choice to, all these things matter more. They are a more important voting, choice is a more important voting issue amongst Jews than Israel. Now, and it's also, in my view, it's also been already, it's already in the bank. That is, there was a pullback, and he's not going to get, depending on which exit you're looking at, a 78 or 83 percent. He's not going to get 80% of the Jewish vote. So it could be 75, even if it's 70. I mean, which would get close to your, it's still, they are still, if you look at the new coalition that makes the Democratic Party, Latinos, African Americans, minorities of all type of working women, unmarried women, who are they all give about a 2-to-1 vote. African Americans more, but virtually all about 67-70% vote for the Democrats. That's the base. Jews are part of that. They're a little bit beyond that, but it's they're part of that base of the Democratic Party, and it's I don't think it has much impact on if the reason for looking at that gap, and by the way, if there is that gap, it's on the economy. It's not because of his performance on the on the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. Yes, over here. Go ahead.
Thanks. You mentioned the gaffe of Governor Romney in stating that if you reelect. Romney said, if you reelect him as president, Iran will get a bomb, and if you elect me, by the way, I'm Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. If you elect Romney, that they will not. I'm curious as to what the thinking is that that's a gaffe. If he lives to regret it, he will do so as president. So I assume that Governor Romney would be pleased with that. And it seems to me that he actually does appeal to the hardcore patriots and people who support a strong military response. I'm just curious about the electoral downside of that comment, why you would feel it was such a mistake, and if you agree that it's a huge mistake. It seems to me that, one more thing, in the debate he also said, which hasn't come up, that he would refuse to negotiate with the Taliban. That would seem to fence him in quite a bit more than his comment on Iran getting the bomb. If anything, I think the president may have a vulnerability in that, like President Bush, he said it was unacceptable that Iran should get a nuclear weapon, and it seems like the government and the foreign policy elites, maybe including some people here, are reconciling themselves to that eventuality.
No, I think your points are well taken. Just to clarify, I don't think there's that much of an electoral downside for Romney as much as potentially a governing one. And, generally speaking, especially when you're not forced into it for political reasons, you want to get through the campaign if you're a candidate and you think you have a decent or a 50-50 chance of governing, right? You want to get through the campaign without tying your hands or doing too much potential damage to your ability to respond to events once you get into office. So that was the context in which I was referring to his remarks. I definitely don't see it as being politically bad for him, per se, one way or the other. So thanks.
We appreciate that Romney is a very flexible candidate in his thinking on these issues. And so a lot depends on what context he raises that issue. If you're looking at straight, public opinion on this question, close to a majority of Americans, and we have polled on this question for the Israel Project, close to a majority support targeted military action against Iran if they, to keep them acquiring military nuclear weapons. And so there is, the public is fairly permissive on this question because Iran is seen as the number one national security threat facing the country. So I don't think he loses on that, side of it. However, if it is seen that, he is wanting to get reengaged in Iraq, wanting to get reengaged in Afghanistan, if it's seen that this is a president who wants America to be much more outward-looking and engaged abroad, then I think Iran becomes one measure of a larger foreign policy that's not where the country wants to go when they think they need to address, strengthening the country, at home. I don't think he'll go there. I think he's flexible enough to, deal with Iran on its own. But I don't think he pays a political price for the position he's put himself in.
Ralph Nurnberger.
Ralph Nurnberger with Georgetown. I'd just like to follow up on Maury's question. I can't tell you how many Jews have come to me and said, I'm a longtime Democrat, but because of Obama on Israel, I can't vote for him. So I'd like to know what the impact has been of this vitriol email campaign. I just got one today. Please contribute to the campaign to discredit Obama. And another one that said, Obama continues his war on Israel. That was just today. And then, has there been any polling on Obama versus the various Republican candidates on Israel? Or not on Israel, but on in the Jewish community?
Didn't we get these same emails before the last election? I mean, don't we go through this, every, I think we could not have had a more heightened, set of, communications that you're about to elect someone, to lead the United States, deeply Muslim, hostile to Israel. I just can't imagine it being more heightened in this election than it was in the last. In terms of policy toward Israel and Iran, I would argue that that Obama has been and Palestine, Israeli interest in the UN, that the United States has been upfront that Israel has a strong ally to push back against it. But I'm just not worried about it. I mean, it's just not. I'm not worried that it's going to produce a drop off in vote. I'd be more worried. To be honest, he's probably losing more because he's not been hard enough on Wall Street. To be honest, on why, if you ask me why they, would be upset with Obama, in terms of their, worldview, it's not because of Israel. There's lots of reasons why could be disappointment among some segments. I've not seen polling on specifically. I've seen voting, polls on, Obama versus each of the candidates amongst Jews. And he gets, somewhere between 60 and 70% of the vote in those polls with about 20% undecided.
Yes, on the left. Yeah.
Stuart Sloan, the American Jewish International Relations Institute. My question has to do with a recent poll we read about in an op-ed article in the Washington Post the other day, which I thought was rather surprising. Polling Israeli voters, or Israeli population, I should say, that only 43% were in favor of a preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, and further, that also less than a majority were in favor, a strong minority were in favor, if asked, that Israel would give up the bomb if Iran would as well. Now that seems to be contrary to conventional wisdom. I wonder if that was your poll, first of all, Stan, and you've done a lot of polling in Israel for TIP. I wonder if your polls agree with that recent poll.
First of all, our polling for the Israel Project are all outside of Israel, either here in Europe or in the Arab states among Palestinians. So I don't. But I do follow the polling there. I do polling in a political context, and I did read the poll you're talking about, and I should have noted that actually that there's a fairly even split on the question of whether Israel should act unilaterally on the Iran nuclear question. So I shouldn't, now overall there's great skepticism about Iran, the context, there's trust in Netanyahu on dealing with the issue, and he has fairly high marks, more broadly, but you're right to underscore that the Israeli public seems fairly even divided, I'd be surprised if they were divided once it happened. I think that everything I've looked at the data on Gaza before it happened. I mean, there's opinion which would move if the Israeli government made a judgment that they had to deal with that, question. So I'm not sure I trust the polling on where it stays. I saw the number on openness, since I don't view that as much of a prospect of happening. But I did also notice the number who favored a nuclear-free zone.
Bob Kopakin.
Bob Kopakin, independent energy consultant. This is for Mr. Greenberg. You said that there will be a third-party candidate in this election, given the public's contempt for Congress, for the economy, the weakness of the economy, and so on. And the three that you posited are Donald Trump, Ron Paul, and Michael Bloomberg. I'm at a loss to consider any one of those a viable third-party candidate, except perhaps Mayor Bloomberg, and I thought that he had pretty much decided that he would not be a third-party candidate. Am I misreading something here? Or?
But it goes to show that we're part of. It's a fair question, but it goes to show how much we're part of the Washington elite. The one who had the lowest support in this was Bloomberg, is the one you thought the most, credible. And Trump gets 8%, I think, in our poll. That 8% of the country, after everything we know, would vote for Trump right now after watching it. If that's all there was 8%.
Yeah.
If it was just Trump, if Trump says, I'm going to be in the national presidential debates, why not? And gets 8% of the vote, has a big impact on the election. It's not at now we throw them in not because we know whether they're going to run. It's just we'll throw anybody in and any name that's plausible, but it's an anchor. I mean, it's a indicator of the opportunity for a third party in a period of great discontent with the parties and politics.
Just on this, the larger point here, at least one of these candidates, Ron Paul, is at least perceived as isolationist, and there's a large.
Trump anti-China, very strong anti-China. You can see Trump running as an anti-China candidate,
and that runs against the majority stream in the Republican Party. What does Mitt Romney need to do? Is there anything that he can do to prevent this isolationist candidate stealing away votes on the right? Does he risk himself moving too far toward that poll if he tries to restrict Ron Paul?
I don't think it's in his hand. I mean, people who jump at these opportunities, are ornery. I mean, are just not, they will have their own reasons for running. Paul may not run because of his son, maybe not want to, have an impact on his Senate, career. But people, it'll be decided on, there'll be some other reason why he decides to go in or not, or others go in or not. And it'll probably be names that we haven't, thought of. As you know, there's also an organization that's created about access, in all 50 states, and there'll be an election, primary election in that process, to select, a candidate. So I don't think the major candidates they can position to minimize the damage, and I think it's part of why, Romney, has moved on this issue. It's in part primary. Though it's hard to be distinctive, I'm sure, because there are other anti-China candidates in the race. So but he's been mainly attacking Obama, on this question. But I think it's with a third party, a fragmenting on this issue to a third party is in his mind, as well as an advantage over Obama. So he should go from his own. If I'm part of his advisory group, going out on China, and Trump is the most plausible, the guy most erratic could do it, who's been most anti-China as the central issue when he was running, when he was advancing his candidacy. So it's that Trump would move it. So it's he should go as far. If politics is the only consideration, he should go as far as he can to be the one who owns that issue.
And then just lastly for both of you, since we can think about events which are 10 months, 11 months away, and everybody will have forgotten our prognostications. Is there, if you had to come up with an October surprise on a foreign policy sense that might tilt that key last percentage point, 2 percentage points, one way or the other, what might that be?
Looking at me, I would say that the last year was a good reminder that our predictions on something like that aren't worth very much. If you had said even in January 17th or whatever it is today that 3 Middle Eastern leaders would be out and several others on the ropes by the end of that calendar year, it would have seemed absurd. So. I would take anything that's said with that with a grain of salt. There's a lot of potential October surprises. I already mentioned China, which is one. I think that look at what's happening in Burma now. I mean, honestly, if you had said 2 months ago that we would be having the level of engagement and sending a U.S. ambassador to Burma. It was unthinkable, and that's something that's been frozen in time, not for a year or 2 years, but for decades, really. So, be saying with Zimbabwe, I don't think that's going to affect the U.S. political election, but that's the other thing that I will throw out to the audience that you should be looking at to add to your list of countries to watch that could be in for big change this year.
If I were looking at uncertainty, I would be looking at Europe and the play out of the euro, and because I think this will be a prolonged, uncertain process which could fly out of control at any point, even in October.
Susan, Stan, thank you very much for joining us today.